Hi, everybody. I am just going to wait a second here before I get started on this little talk. I am going to be just talking a little bit today around some of the data and the facts surrounding the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines and the confusion and some of the myths that have arisen around fertility and pregnancy and these vaccines. I want to preface this whole conversation by saying that I am not a virologist, I am not an epidemiologist, I'm not a scientist, and I'm not an MD. I am an integrative, holistic fertility expert, and I have every intention throughout this talk of entirely staying in my own lane. And what I mean by that is that I'm not here to tell you whether or not you should be vaccinated against COVID-19. I'm not here to tell you whether or not you are doing something right or wrong with regards to this at all. What I am here to do is try to give you as much information as I can about what is actually true and factual surrounding this big, huge topic, and leave you to either come to your own conclusions or to open up some questions so that if I can help you decipher what it is that you want to do, I'm more than happy to play that role. And again, within the context of what I know. The reason why I'm even remotely qualified to talk to you about this is because the part of the Chinese medicine world that I sort of practice within and come from is very integrative. As a fertility practitioner and as an obstetric practitioner and even as a doula, going back 20 years when I first started my practice, all of my patients or clients are always working concurrently with another practitioner, with a Western medicine doctor, frequently, because so much of my practice is a fertility-based practice. I'm working with reproductive endocrinologists, and as such, I've really made it my role to fully comprehend both the Eastern and the Western medicine. My book, Feed Your Fertility, is all about that. We have a whole big segment in there about what the East says and what the West says. And why I think that's important is because it's really critical that we are able to translate across modalities what it is that we're doing so we can make sure that things are aligned and that everybody is getting the best and most continuous possible care. And so as a result, and because I'm a nerd, I have made it, my role in my business to do my best to really understand the Western biology and as it applies to Chinese medicine. So everything that I'm talking to you about today is stuff that I've really worked hard to make sure that I understand as clearly as possible. But by all means, please ask questions. And if I don't know the answer, I will go and get the answer for you. I have no intention of standing up here and putting on some, scientist expert hat, but rather to try to unpack and decipher all of this information for you guys, because it's a lot and it's confusing, and we have really been up against so much misinformation, as I know you're all aware, throughout this entire last 4 years, but especially over the last year or so since we've been dealing with the pandemic. There's just been so much crazy town hyperbole and straight up, false data being thrown at people, and it's incredibly hard to decipher what's true and what's not true. So let's get started. I'm just going to talk through a few slides, and then if you have questions, you can enter them here in the chat, and I'll do my best to address them. You can also DM me, you can email me, or reach out any way you'd like. So let's just talk a little bit about, first of all, this mRNA vaccine and the rumor that it causes infertility. There was, right at the outset, even before these vaccines were approved, some folks online started posting this information that the protein that is built by your body in response to the vaccine had the same sequence, or some of the same sequence, as proteins that are found in the human placenta. And the hypothesis that was made was that because the protein had some of the same sequences as the placenta, that the antibodies that were then created to fight off the COVID vaccine, or to create antibodies against COVID should you contract it, would also create an autoimmune response against the placenta and harm it, leading to infertility or leading to miscarriage. I just want to start by saying this is 100% false. It has been disputed over and over again by every major reputable organization, by all kinds of OBGYNs, fertility specialists, doctors, epidemiologists, and scientists. It is not true. There is no biological mechanism for this vaccine to harm your fertility. And one of the reasons why we know that's true is because if it were the case, then the vaccine itself, then COVID itself would likely be causing a lot of miscarriages, and it's just not. COVID itself would be potentially leading to infertility, and it's not. So we have enough of a massive epidemic. We have enough people who have been exposed to COVID, not to mention that we now have millions and millions of people. I think last I checked, it was over 7 million people worldwide that have also been vaccinated against COVID. And we are just simply not seeing these outcomes at all. So the first thing, if you are thinking about becoming pregnant, or if you already are pregnant, you can, at least be assured that nothing in the vaccine is going to harm your fertility. So let's start there. Let's get that out of the way. Nothing in the vaccine is going to harm your fertility. COVID, on the other hand, well, it certainly isn't likely to directly harm your fertility. It is causing some long-term consequences for many of the people who contract it. So we always have to look at the pros and the cons here. What makes the most sense given the circumstances that we're in? So we have to also stop for a moment and recognize that we're in a very special, unique moment in history and in all of our lives. And so we have to look at things through a slightly different lens. It's not just as simple as it's about me. So as we move forward, let's also keep those things in mind. So I just want to quickly talk about how the mRNA vaccines work. I don't want to bore you to death with cell biology, and I also don't want to pretend like I am like some fancy cell biologist. So I'm going to try to narrow this down again in a way that makes it really easy to understand. And I'm going to post a little series of slides on this page and on Instagram when I'm done doing this little talk as well. So you'll be able to reference them if you want to come back and listen to this again. So what is important to understand is that these mRNA vaccines are, obviously they are a new technology insofar as this is the first time that they've been used in this way. And what I mean by in this way is that this is the first time that these are being used on a mass scale like this to try and attempt to inoculate the entire population. Now, because we live in this world that is unfortunately so inundated with conspiracy theories, and because social media has allowed people who can't think and say anything to have a platform, a lot of information has come out into the public that has made it sound like these vaccines are extremely dangerous and that they're new, and that they can do things like harm our DNA, and that they can do things like infiltrate different parts of our bodies and permanently change them. So that again is a lot of misinformation. And so I'm going to do my best to give you a quick explanation, and you'll see this again in the slides that I'm going to post a little bit later. So for starters, we have a cell. All of our body is comprised of trillions of cells. And within those cells, it's so complex, it's so crazy, all of the different apparatus that are within our cells that make our bodies actually function, that allow us to exist, literally exist. The center of the cell is something called the nucleus, and inside the nucleus we have our DNA. And the DNA is basically our personal computer coding. It's everything, it's the roadmap to our existence, it's how our bodies and how our cells express everything that we need in order to survive and function. Now that DNA is super sacred, and it exists inside the cell itself. and it doesn't come out, it's just in there, and it translates its information into the part of the cell that functions and makes stuff through another enzyme called RNA. And RNA, basically the job of the RNA is just to make like a photocopy of the sequence of the DNA that tells our body how to function. So RNA makes this photocopy of a portion of the DNA that our body is asking for in that moment. And then the RNA moves itself into what we call the cytoplasm, which is the nucleus is on the inside. The cytoplasm is the sort of liquid part of the cell that surrounds the nucleus, and it has all this stuff in it, all this apparatus to actually make proteins. The RNA takes that photocopy of DNA into the cytoplasm, and it translates it. It makes yet another copy of it onto something called messenger RNA, mRNA. That's what the vaccine is. mRNA is, again, just a little piece of computer code with specific instructions. And that specific instruction is then taken up by your cells and turned into proteins. And those proteins are then used for whatever purpose they may be needed. It might be to fight an infection. It might be to digest a banana. I mean, we make proteins for literally everything in our bodies. So if you contract COVID-19, then what will happen is that virus will make its way into your cells. The little spiky part that you've seen a bazillion times by now is the part that attaches to the cell, makes its way into our cells, and then takes it over. And while that's happening, the virus then gets inside, it takes over the cell, and it starts to replicate. And as the replication of the virus is happening within our bodies, we start to get sicker and sicker. While we're getting sicker and sicker, our bodies are rushing as fast as they can to create an antibody against that virus. The antibody, once it is pumped out into our system, will attach itself to the spike protein and neutralize it. However, if we've contracted COVID, depending on how much exposure we've had, depending on certain pre-existing conditions we might have, depending on the overall state of our health and wellness, or to be completely honest, sometimes it's utterly arbitrary and we don't know why, some people will have a very severe response to this virus replicating in their body. And that's why we are seeing a percentage of people who do get very sick, who end up in the hospital, and then a small percentage of people who die. The ones who don't die but end up in the hospital are also unfortunately facing a lot of long haul symptoms. That seems quite similar to like Epstein-Barr, a lot of chronic fatigue, body aches. Some people are experiencing lung scarring. So there's really serious consequences to getting COVID. It's not the flu, it's not a cold. And unfortunately, there's no true way to say you're gonna get sick and you're not. So that's sort of one of the primary things that we're up against here, is that while we can say that people who are older and who do have pre-existing conditions have a harder time with this virus than most younger people, that's not true across the board. It's certainly not definitive. So that's what happens if you get the virus. Your body's going to make these antibodies, and it's going to do its best to fight against the virus as it has sort of infiltrated your system. And some people get super sick, and some people get over it fairly quickly. Some people have long-term consequences, some people do not. The vaccine is basically just truncating this whole process. And what the mRNA vaccine consists of is that same little piece of coding that, instead of coming from the virus itself, is just getting directly deposited into your arm, into the muscle. This little bit of messenger RNA then, which cannot return back into the nucleus. So remember that inside the nucleus is the DNA. The DNA translates its information to the RNA. The RNA then copies that information onto the messenger RNA. The messenger RNA gives the message to the cell, hey man, make this antibody against the virus. When you get the vaccine, you're bypassing the part where the virus gets into the cells, and then the cells have to respond by going and asking the DNA for the coding and the RNA to the mRNA, and then the making of the antibodies. So basically, it's similar in the sense that your body, if you get COVID, is going to make the same mRNA, and that mRNA is going to then translate into creating antibodies against the COVID virus. But while that's all going on, you may or may not be becoming very sick. Whereas with the vaccine, what happens is we're cutting right to the chase. You're getting that little snippet of mRNA deposited right into your muscles. That muscles in your deltoid here, that muscle will then kind of uptake the material from the vaccine, and that piece of mRNA will then be inside the cells, and the cells will get the same exact message that it may have gotten if you had the virus, and then begin to make antibodies. Now, the message that is being disseminated by the mRNA is actually teaching your cells how to make the spike protein itself. So instead of you having to get sick and have that spike protein in your body, what you're getting instead is the an instruction kit for your cells to make the spike protein. And then when your body sees that spike protein, probably displayed on the outside of the cell, that's a lot of times where it will be, where the immune system will kind of pick up on it, and the immune system will go, oh my gosh, there's this foreign spike protein in our body, in our cells, and then it will set out to make antibodies, and those antibodies will then attach to the spike protein and neutralize it. Essentially, that's what all vaccines do. But the difference between the mRNA vaccines and the vaccines that we're used to getting is that there's no virus in the actual vaccine. Typical vaccines actually contain either an attenuated or like a killed version of the virus. So it's like a little tiny bit of virus that our body is subjected to, and then that consequently will make antibodies from that. This is actually, there is no virus in the mRNA vaccines at all. It's just this little piece of coding teaching our own body how to make the spike protein, and then our own body will then respond by making antibodies to neutralize that spike protein. And then a few weeks later, we're gonna get a booster, and the booster shot is essentially a challenge test. It's because our bodies have now already made these antibodies once, and they create a memory of that. Our immune systems are so complex and so incredible, but when we get sick, our bodies will create like what we call memory cells, so that if you come in contact with that same pathogen again, your body remembers how to fight it. And the booster is a challenge test, essentially making sure that our bodies will remember how to fight it. And that's why we do it in a few weeks later. There may be future vaccines that come out that don't require that we have this challenge test or this booster, but there's just a bunch that we still don't really know. So moving on, I hope that was a clear enough explanation. And like I said, I will be providing some slides a little bit later that you guys can look at here on the page. But the same thing, essentially, again, just to repeat, is happening when you get the virus and or when you get the vaccine. It's just that there's a bunch of steps with the virus where you may become sick on the way to that occurring. And with the vaccine, we're skipping all those steps. There's no actual virus in your body. We're just giving your body a lesson plan. Here's how you make the spike protein. Once the body makes the spike protein, it then will develop these antibodies to neutralize them. The other thing that's important to know about the mRNA is that it gets resolved in your body within a couple of hours. So that little messenger that's been injected into your cells, it doesn't stick around very long. It's not self-replicating. It deteriorates once your body has the information that teaches it how to make the spike protein. So you're not just going to keep making a bunch of spike protein. You're going to make just a little bit, just enough for your immune system to recognize it and to come in and neutralize it. So in terms of concerns with long-term effects from this vaccine, there's not really a lot to be concerned about because it's very, very short term in terms of how long it exists within our bodies. And while I know there's a lot of stuff that circulates, certainly from some of the anti-vaccine platforms, that vaccines can cause these, long-term effects months and years down the road, from the literally 100 plus years of vaccine research that we have, that doesn't actually bear out in the science. So we have to always remember this notion that correlation doesn't equal causation. Just because something occurs in a similar time frame to receiving a vaccine doesn't mean that it was caused by the vaccine. And again, because we're in this very unique situation where we're facing a global pandemic that is extraordinarily transmissible and that has obviously completely gone out of control, we have to look at things through a slightly different lens. We have to consider the cost-benefit analysis. It's not as simple as saying, I don't feel like taking the polio vaccine, because we all know, at least here in the United States, that the risk of getting polio is virtually nil. So you can make that individual choice because you are able to rely on everyone else around you not having polio. This is a different situation. It's sucky. We all know it. But we got to make a choice. We have to make the best choice given where we're at. And so we have to definitely make some harder decisions than we're all really used to making. So once, the reason why this matters is because we have to just distinguish between what makes the most sense for us. If we're on a fertility journey, does it make the most sense to stay at high risk of contracting COVID? And obviously, depending where you live, the risk of contracting it is going to be different. Here in Los Angeles, it's extraordinarily high. So we have to weigh that against what might the risk of the vaccines be. And so far, in terms of the clinical data that we've seen, which is quite significant, and in addition to that, the millions of people that have already been vaccinated, we are seeing that there's not very much to be concerned about whatsoever. One of the questions that sometimes comes up is, well, we don't know anything about pregnant women in this vaccine yet. Pregnant women were not included in the original data, in the original studies. And there's a good reason for that, so I also wanted to kind of unpack and articulate that. When you do a clinical trial, there is a whole ethics board that's involved in who can and who can't be included. And one of the things that comes up is when you are part of a clinical trial, half the group will receive a placebo. They won't receive the actual vaccine, whereas the other half of the group will receive the vaccine. The reason why that becomes an ethics issue for pregnant women is because it is deemed unethical to withhold a known or a potential cure from somebody who might really need it. So that is why they didn't include pregnant women, because they don't want the responsibility of having a bunch of pregnant women running around who've only received the placebo and who may get sick. So pregnant women were excluded from the trials. However, that doesn't mean that the vaccine isn't safe for pregnancy. It just means that pregnant women weren't specifically looked at. So as a result of that, then once the vaccine started getting used in the public, people were starting to ask those questions. Is it safe? Is it safer to get the vaccine, or is it safer to continue to risk getting COVID? And that is sort of when some of this crazy rumor stuff started flying around. So what recently occurred in December is that a bunch of the professional organizations like the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, and a bunch of other professional organizations related specifically to fertility and pregnancy, they all came out with position papers. And as I've said since the outset of this talk, I am not the expert. I like to listen to the experts. I do not stand here and say I know more than any of them, or that my capacity to interpret science or this data is greater than theirs. So what the experts are saying specifically about the COVID vaccine and pregnancy, I'm going to quickly summarize the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology's position, which is very synchronous with the rest of the college or the rest of the associations. Are all basically saying the same thing, which is this. COVID-19 vaccines should be offered to lactating individuals similar to non-lactating individuals when they meet the criteria for the vaccine based on prioritization groups. Vaccines have not been tested in pregnant women, so we don't have specific safety data. However, the decision to vaccinate should be made between individuals and their physicians based on personal medical history, virus activity level in your community, occupation exposure and risk, and any available information regarding fetal or neonatal safety. So they're basically coming out and saying, look, we believe that the decisions around using this vaccine for pregnant women, for lactating women, that they should be made between a woman and her doctor, that any woman who wishes to be vaccinated should, and that we do not see, even though there are not specific groups within these studies yet, there will be studies done certainly on pregnant women, but at the moment we don't have a specific group of pregnant versus not pregnant women getting a placebo versus getting the vaccine. But these organizations are essentially coming out and saying we cannot see a biological reason why it would harm somebody who is pregnant versus somebody who is not. So while it is a personal decision still, and nobody is saying you absolutely should do this or not, it's a very important conversation to have with your doctor, your fertility specialist, your OBGYN, your general practitioner, whoever you go to for information and trying to make these decisions, not the internet. So in addition to the ACOG, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the American Society of Reproductive Medicine also came out with a joint statement, and they also emphasized that they believe pregnant women should have access to the vaccine, that lactating women should have access to the vaccine, and also that the vaccine should be offered to anyone who is going through a fertility process. So whether you are trying to become pregnant or working with a reproductive endocrinologist, talk to your doctor about the benefits of if potentially being vaccinated before you become pregnant. And again, because we've sort of right off the cuff here dispelled any notion that the vaccine itself has a physiological mechanism that could harm your fertility, you really want to take that off the table and instead weigh the vaccine itself against COVID. Those are the two things that we should be comparing. The risks from the vaccine against the risks of COVID-19. And the risk from the vaccine at the moment, based on the data that we have, which is fairly substantial, is incredibly low. And the vaccines do seem to be very effective. Whereas we know that the risk of COVID, can be quite serious. And there's no way to really know who for sure will have a serious outcome and who won't. So continuing to, just always look at the cost benefit analysis, and once again recognizing like this is a difficult situation that we're all in here. It's not as simple as I don't feel like doing this. It really is a question of what, what's the lesser of two evils, essentially, contracting COVID or potentially subjecting yourself to this novel vaccine. The novel vaccine and the safety data around it would suggest that we don't have a ton to be concerned about. There have been no deaths associated with the vaccine, which doesn't mean you're not going to see reports that so-and-so got vaccinated and died the next day. People still die, but when we look at the grand scheme of things, oftentimes it gets conflated where somebody received a vaccine and then they died of a heart attack and we go, oh my gosh, the vaccine caused a heart attack. They would have had a heart attack anyway. So we have to, again, back up and look at the bigger picture here. So far, none of the data is pointing directly to any deaths associated with the vaccine. And quite frankly, even if, God forbid, there was some rare occurrence where somebody received the vaccine and they were immunocompromised or something unusual occurred that ultimately resulted in death, again, we have to weigh that against the hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people who have died so far of COVID, more than 1 million people, I think 2 million people now worldwide, the United States possessing more than 25% of those total infections and deaths. So nobody wants anybody to die. Nobody wants to have to make a hard decision like that. But so far the data really is showing us that we do not have to be concerned about serious risks from these mRNA vaccines because they don't contain any live virus, because they are self-resolving in a short period of time, and because the mechanism for how they function just doesn't have the biological ability to translate into these major systemic problems that we're hearing about through a bunch of different social media channels. So in summary, looking at these vaccine recommendations, There is zero evidence at all that the vaccine causes infertility. And also, if it was a concern, we would likely be seeing fertility issues arising from people who have COVID-19, because again, it's the same stuff. We're not putting new stuff in. The other thing that's important to recall here too is that the adjuvants that are used in most vaccines are, no, they're not in this vaccine. So even though people get freaked out about the adjuvants, these other chemicals that are packaged with vaccines to help us have a better immune response to them, the COVID vaccine, the mRNA vaccines actually don't contain any additional stuff. It's the little snippet of mRNA wrapped up in a little tiny ball of fat, sort of like, think of like olive oil almost. And then it's got some salt water and some sugar. It's like a saline solution that makes it similar to your own body's blood plasma. So your body is able to recognize and break down every single component of this vaccine in a very short period of time. It doesn't hang out in your body any longer. So again, if we were concerned that the vaccine caused infertility, we would be concerned that the virus causes infertility, and none of the data is suggesting that the virus causes infertility. The other thing to keep in mind is that, unfortunately, pregnant women are at a higher risk of contracting severe COVID infections. So if you're pregnant and you get COVID, you're in a higher risk category of getting very sick. So again, just weighing that cost-benefit analysis and knowing that there is no perfect answer, absolutely, but being in a higher risk category, particularly with these new variants that are appearing more transmissible, and potentially more virulent, again, just another thing to really think about. What makes more sense in the cost-benefit analysis of this bigger picture here of the situation? And then the other thing is that all these major medical associations have all come together to provide us with the same piece of data, which is that they sincerely do not see any mechanism whatsoever that fertility or pregnancy will be impacted by the COVID vaccines, but that they do agree that fertility and pregnancy, not fertility like becoming pregnant, but that pregnancy itself can be a risk factor for having a more serious outcome from COVID. So of course we know it varies wildly from person to person, but some of the serious side effects of COVID-19 include permanent lung scarring, kidney damage, heart damage, strokes, blood clotting issues. It's not a joke, right? This is a really serious virus. It is my sincere wish for everyone that I know and love and everyone that I can possibly reach out there in the world that you do not contract this virus, that you do not think it is no big deal. Knowing that, yeah, the majority of people are probably going to do just fine, but a lot of people are going to have a rough go with this. And more importantly, we have got to give our healthcare workers out there a break. They are inundated and overwhelmed and exhausted by having to treat these patients day in and day out. Living in Los Angeles, it's been quite a time to see that our healthcare facilities are totally overrun with COVID patients. People are completely exhausted and essentially begging the community to stop transmitting it. And this is one of the fastest ways that we're going to get here. In terms of the notion of herd immunity, that's the other thing that I wanted to quickly touch on, which is that we have definitely been fed this sort of false notion from some of the less scientific minds floating around on social media, that we can achieve herd immunity if everybody just gets sick. And we don't need the vaccine because it's spreading so fast. If we extrapolate the number of people who have died from the number of people who have had COVID at this time, I believe in the United States, less than 20% of the population. It might even be even lower than that, maybe 15%. I can get those numbers for you directly. We are careening towards 500,000 deaths here in the US in under a year. If we extrapolate that and multiply that number by what it would look like for the entire population to get COVID, you would be looking at mass casualties and death and overrun of our society from the healthcare system all the way on down that we simply cannot afford. And furthermore, true herd immunity has actually never been achieved from it just roaming through society. We've only really achieved herd immunity in the past through vaccines. So in this particular instance, we have to find a way out of this pandemic that has run amok, that has run completely out of control, and that is creating really catastrophic consequences for our society. And so for anyone who is able to get the vaccine and discusses that with their doctor and their doctor agrees, it is my perspective that from a social standpoint, it's the right thing to do. Never mind the issue of protecting yourself and hopefully not getting COVID at all. One of the things that I've observed as an American through this process, particularly my generation and those who are younger than me, and I am in my late 40s, is that we as a society, we have never really been asked to sacrifice anything for the greater good. We have never been put in a position, in a quote unquote wartime position, where we have had to make decisions that aren't just about ourselves and our individual family members, but are instead, for what our society needs as a whole. And I know I come back to this concept over and over again, but it's truly one of my personal guiding principles in my life and in my philosophy as an acupuncturist, as an herbalist, as a teacher, as a coach, every hat I wear, as a parent, every role I play. And that is the idea that what Chinese medicine tells us is that we are a microcosm of the macrocosm. We are one tiny little piece of the greater environment, the greater universe around us. And so if I'm a droplet in the ocean, my little droplet, it can't exist. It will evaporate if the rest of the ocean isn't also made up of equally healthy droplets. So bearing that in mind, it is a challenge for us as Americans. It is a challenge for us in ways that we haven't had to look at and face before. To really think about, well, what does it mean to do this in the name of making sure that all the people around me can be healthier and well? And I really think it comes down to the bottom line notion that there is no individual health without public health. You cannot be healthy if you're walking down the street surrounded by people who are sick and dying. You cannot be healthy if you are surrounded by a community of people who are also starving and unwell or homeless or anything else, right? We all have to have a certain standard of health and a certain standard of living in order for the whole to function, in order for our society to function. And this is really the first time that most of us are being called upon to shift our thinking away from individualism, what's best for me, what's best for my family, what's best for just those around me, to what's best for the world, what's best for society at large. And again, it's not my role to say you should or shouldn't, but I just wanted to come on here today to say, please consider all those variables as you're making this decision. Please speak to your doctor. Please try not to get your scientific information from Facebook posts. Look past that. Look at the actual data. Or if you don't know how to look at the actual data, ask somebody who does. If you have questions, reach out to me. If I don't have the answers, I can get those answers for you. Because again, I'm not up here posing as a scientist or an epidemiologist or an infectious disease expert or even a public health expert. I'm here as an individual who works in a holistic way as part of the natural wellness community. I'm on the integrative side of things, so I tend to interact a lot more with Western medicine doctors, and I have a pretty good understanding of the pathophysiology of the human body as a result. And so I think it's really important as a integrative and as a holistic care provider to stand up here and say, we have to be willing to take the best of all modalities and bring them together. And we have to look at every individual situation and decide for ourselves what is the best approach for today, for this circumstance? Is it to apply the principles of Western medicine, like these mRNA vaccines? Or should we just stay over here in the natural realm and keep taking vitamins and supplements? And I would argue that the answer is right here in the middle, that we need to look at what is the most direct path out of this pandemic so that we can have our society return to as close to a normal state as it did before. And how can we care for ourselves through that process? How can we make sure our own bodies are strong and capable of fighting any pathogen that it might come up against? But can we also be realistic that there's no absolute certain way to know whether or not whether or not our bodies are going to manage to overcome this virus without the vaccine? So please do feel free to post any questions that you might have here in the chat, or you can reach out to me privately via DM. You can email me at laura@mothernurturela.com. You can find me on Instagram. I'm findable, and I'm happy to talk this through with you and provide you with any data that you might wish for, or point you in the right direction if I don't have access to it. I hope you guys have an awesome day. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope to connect with you all very soon. Take care.